It's Crumble's birthday, and we're celebrating with a sweet deal. Today only, you can get a 6-pack of Crumble for the price of a 4-pack. That's 6 fresh gourmet desserts for the price of 4. Treat yourself, bring a friend, or share with family, because birthdays are better when everybody gets a little something special. Don't miss it. 6 for 4 desserts. Today only at Crumble.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another Infinite Inning Reissue episode. I am, as ever, your host, Stephen Goldman. This episode revisits number 76 from 2018. The Cubs are headed back to the postseason this year, so it seems like a safe time to make fun of one of their worst general managers, a fella who knew his fish, by which I don't mean the Marlins, but because his main line was not in ball players, but in seafood. Or maybe lake food, given that it was Chicago. Is that safe? Hey, we have some invasive zebra mussels for y'all. Tasty treat. Y'all don't mind a little hepatitis between friends, do ya? Right this way. This also seems like an appropriate story for a week in which the Washington Nationals seem to have hired themselves a new general manager for the first time since the Taft administration. I'll say a little bit more about that later. This reissue is coming out a day later than I usually get to it, in part because I realized I wanted to write about it at Baseball Prospectus before I spoke about it here. The second tale of the episode goes outside of baseball for a little American history. My springboard back then was the tomahawk chop, a subject I've written about and talked about quite a bit. I fear too much, perhaps. So much so that Sabre, possibly to their regret, asked me to contribute an essay on the origins of the chop to a book that is coming out, I believe, around Christmas this year. When I wrote it, I spent a great deal more time on Tammany Hall than the Braves ball club because ultimately that's where the Braves name comes from, and therefore that's the grandpa of the chop, so to speak. And Tammany itself, the name is taken from a semi-mythical chief named Tammany. So to really get to the point of the whole thing, when we start talking about appropriation, we have to go all the way back to when William Penn first showed up in his Pennsylvania, not colony, proprietorship, and started making deals with the local Native Americans, of whom Tammany was one. And from there, you somehow end up in New York in Democratic Party machine politics. As you know, my thesis is baseball is everything. Everything is baseball. It's all intertwined. Baseball is representative of America. And that is one way that the strands of our political and sports history tend to weave together so that the Democratic Party sort of annexed this Native American iconography, then the ball club annexes the political iconography from Tammany Hall and doesn't really disclose that, so a lot of people who are ignorant of its past say to themselves, well, we're either honoring Native Americans or we're parodying them, and when really it could be either, or both, or neither. Finally, more recently, people say, well, wait, these are real people we're talking about. And Commissioner Manfred comes out and says, it's not people, it's marketing, which that is America to me. That is the whole problem in a nutshell. He spoke quickly and drank a glass of water. Well, the story in this episode is not squarely on the subject of the chop, because all right already, but on something adjacent, an episode from what we call the Indian Wars, which makes our guns first Western expansion sound a little less one-sided than it was. It starts with a guy named Meeker and the job he had, Indian agent. The Indian agents were supposed to manage relations between Native Americans and settlers in their locations in a kind of even-handed way, but often it was an exploitative graft position. In short, many of them were crooks. In Mel Brooks' Western Blazing Saddles, there's a little speech given by the bad guy, played by the late, great Harvey Korman, in which he lists out all the bad people he wants to bring in to harass the good guys. I won't do this justice. Korman was great, but he says, I want you to round up every vicious criminal and gunslinger in the West. I want rustlers, cutthroats, murderers, bounty hunters, desperados, mugs, pugs, thugs, nitwits, halfwits, dimwits, vipers, snipers, con men, Indian agents, Mexican bandits, muggers, buggerers, bushwhackers, hornswogglers, horse thieves, train robbers, bank robbers, ass kickers, shit kickers, and Methodists. Note that I left out one thing from Corman's list, which was just a slur on lesbians. It seemed unnecessary for me to repeat it. That film both was and is politically incorrect, whether today or when it came out in the 70s. That's some of the point. But there's no need for me to upset anyone here. In context, maybe it's fine, as are all the other slurs in the movie. But I don't want it on my podcast. More to the point, Indian Agents is so specific compared to the rest of the list that it always jumps out at me, so much that I tend to miss most of the rest. I think this is the first time I noted that particular slur I just mentioned. It's just so blunt about these guys who are often bigots with a license to steal. Right now, today, the administration is engaged in a campaign to eradicate anything that might not celebrate the greatness of America or Americans, certain Americans anyway, and they are going after the signage in our national parks and historical monuments. I guess Fort Pillow Historic Park in Tennessee is a state park, so our great white father can't touch that one without complicity from the governor, but that's the site where, after a battle fought on April 12, 1864, Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a guy who Shelby Foote repeatedly called a genius back in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, massacred over 200 black troops when his men overran the site. After the battle, Forrest wrote to his bosses, "It is hoped that these facts, the facts of what he called the slaughter, will demonstrate to the Northern people that Negro soldiers cannot cope with Southerners." Because, who can cope with anyone when the battle has been lost, you've put down your guns, you're relying on the protections afforded prisoners of war, and instead the opposition just cuts you down. That's not coping only if murder is not coping. And then he went home and founded the KKK. I don't know why you would have a Fort Pillow Historic Park and Cemetery if you couldn't faithfully represent what happened there and what we might need to take away from the fact that it happened. Hell, I don't know why you would have a Chicago Cubs if you couldn't faithfully represent them either. Cap Anson wasn't there. He didn't do it. He didn't say it. King Kelly didn't drink it or sleep with it or have it cough on him. Ross Barnes wasn't just a fair foul fake. Ned Williamson wasn't just a park effect fiend. Al Spalding wasn't part of a cult honest. Frank Chance was a pussycat. Evers was a noble heart. And Tinker a mensch. Rogers Hornsby was kind to children and animals. Sometimes, when that woman shot Billy Georges, he had only gone to her hotel room to return a book. Ed Boucher exposed himself to those kids because there was fluoride in the water and he thought it would be educational for someone involved in the transaction. Ralph Kiner had range. Larry Boa had range. Bill Buckner had range. Sammy Sosa, well, never mind. I still don't understand that whole thing. Did he juice? Yeah, probably. But a lot of players did, and they weren't disavowed the way that he seems to have been until fairly recently. My point is that if there's no such thing as an objective truth, some large set of facts somewhere that most of us can agree upon, then you or I or he or she or they do not share the same world. That sounds histrionic, but it's true. And here's a random example. And I'll say in advance my knowledge about this is pretty thin, and for good reason. I have no idea if anyone today really believes this particular conspiracy theory. But hang with me on this for a sec. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a German cat named Adam Weishaupt, a college professor at U Ingolstadt. One biographer characterized him as a familiar hazard of academic and collegiate life, the clever, cantankerous, self-absorbed, and self-deceiving bore. My sense of his story is that he wanted to be a Freemason, which was a faddish thing to do back then. It was and is a fraternal society, but with a frisson of ritual and mysticism. I don't know if Weishaupt was frustrated with the Masons, they did charge high initiation fees, or just wanted to have his own version of the same with his own rituals and sashes and aprons. But whatever his motive, he went off and he founded his own group in 1776, the Illuminati. They came into being in Bavaria. This is the dawning of the age of Bavaria. The Freemasons, who, as I said, are still a thing, have some very impressive buildings around the country. The great big temple across the street from City Hall in Philadelphia, the George Washington Masonic National Memorial and House of Pancakes in Alexandria, Virginia, which just towers over the landscape, which it should because it is a tower and it does have ample parking. Maybe 30 years ago or so, I wandered in there. It contains an impressive statue of our flawed national papa, George Washington, who was a member. The statue has him holding his hammer and his trowel and wearing his apron, and it is just not what you're used to seeing in depictions of George Washington. It's as if you went to the Lincoln Memorial and his statue was wearing a party hat. 87 years ago. These secret societies had something in common with modern video games or Scientology. The more levels you play, the more upgrades you get. It should be a perpetual motion device for adherence, but Herr Weishaupt was not the greatest administrator. He failed to make up a lot of the lore that would have to be revealed as adherents climb the ladder. Next issue? There is no next issue. I don't know how to resolve this cliffhanger. You know, men, I would say I'm sorry, but the German language lacks a word for that. The members got fed up, so he decided that rather than trying to gather new members of his own, he would kind of have his guys infiltrate the Masons and be a cuckoo within Masonry, take it over from within. I have no patience with this story. Ultimately, the Illuminati somehow got crossways with the Bavarian monarch, the Elector, Charles Theodore. No one called him Chuck Teddy, I don't think. And they were officially suppressed, and Herr Weishaupt skedaddled. The Illuminati were over. They were done. Yet the idea that there was a secret society infiltrating a larger secret society got into people's heads. The Illuminati could be anywhere, doing anything. I don't know if this is the first conspiracy theory, but it's one of the earliest and most successful and long-lasting. They could be puppeteering the American government, even now. You know, when you look at Weishaupt's portrait, he bears a pretty good resemblance to George Washington. Who's to say that when he absquatulated from Bavaria, he didn't come here, bonk the good general on the head, and take over? They had already done it in France, you know, the revolution was all they're doing. The part of this that's kind of hilarious in retrospect is what the Illuminati's supposed goals were. They wanted, wrote one John Robeson, and I quote from his essay of 1786, a long time ago, to abolish the laws protecting property and plant a democracy or oligarchy on its ruins. The Illuminati accounted all princes, usurpers, and tyrants and all privileged orders as their abettors. They intended to establish a government of morality, as they called it, where talents and character should alone lead to preferment. They intended to establish universal liberty and equality, the imprescriptible rights of man. That sounds pretty good, actually. I want to quote this tract a little more because it really starts to sound familiar. And as necessary preparations for all this, they intended to root out all religion and ordinary morality, and even to break the bonds of domestic life by destroying the veneration for marriage vows, and by taking the education of children out of the hands of the parents. Great Scott! Really, I've never heard anything like that before. When we see how eagerly the Illuminati endeavored to insinuate their brethren into all offices which gave them influence on the public mind, and particularly into seminaries of education, we should be particularly careful to prevent them, and ought to examine with anxious attention the manner of thinking of all who offer themselves for teachers of youth. Best watch the colleges and test the teachers. We know that the enemy is working among us. The vocabulary of the Illuminati is current in certain societies among us. We should discourage all secret assemblies which afford opportunities to the disaffected, and all conversations which foster any notions of political perfection and create hankerings after unattainable happiness. These only increase the discontents of the unfortunate, the idle, and the worthless. Above all, we should be careful to discourage and check immorality and licentiousness in every shape, for this will of itself subvert every government and will subject us to the vile tyranny of the mob. Who is this us? I don't think he's talking about everyone. He's talking about the aristocracy, the people in charge. The threat is always the same, and the prescription is always the same. Robert Welch Jr., the founder of the John Birch Society, guys who saw communist conspiracies everywhere, was still talking about the Illuminati being bent on world domination in the 1960s. And again, the proposed fix is always the same. Somehow the answer to infiltrators who want to control you, supposedly, is always for you to control everyone else, assuming you are a wealthy, conservative, heterosexual capitalist. I am not criticizing 3 of the 4 things I just named. I am not wealthy by definition, but I have done okay by capitalism and vice versa. I happen to be a heterosexual. Everyone else can be who they want to be as long as they do it with love. And yes, according to community standards too, because that is the real limit to what is right, what is legal, and indeed what is possible. And like everything else, community standards are a question of education and persuasion, not compulsion. The people who fear being compelled, for whatever reasons of their own psychology, also believe in compelling others. They can't see that the community might evolve and change, and they fear that change, even if it is organic and not the result of subversion. And sometimes it's an understandable thing, that fear. That change can be as small and insignificant as something I think most of us experience at one point or another in our lives, which is the music of our youth going out of style and being replaced by something radically different, something that might not appeal to us as much. That can be dislocating. So dislocating that sometimes oldsters team up and form panels to condemn satanic rock and roll and burn records or question whether the song "We're Not Gonna Take It" is going to cause the cities to burst into flame. Did they see the video? It features the bad guy from Animal House, not Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I started out by mentioning that the Nationals are hiring a new general manager. As of this date, the Nationals have lost 94 games. That they are not going to lose 100 seems like a matter of luck, because their pitching staff is just short of historically bad. It's certainly as bad as any we've seen this century, with an ERA over 5 in a league which has an ERA closer to 4. Their defense is not great, center fielder Jacob Young notwithstanding, so the pitchers have had help, but the bottom line is what it is. Imagine, and this is where I went for my Baseball Prospectus column this week, if we couldn't tell the truth about the Nationals, or that they could suppress the truth about themselves. How could we judge the approach the new boss is taking to getting better? How would we even know that they needed to get better? That's why you tell the truth about your country. If you can say your mom isn't perfect, and the old gal has developed some flaws, hasn't she, then you can say your country isn't perfect, and how, why, and when, and then you roll up your sleeves, and you pitch in to help make it better, and you demand the leadership makes it better. And yeah, they hate when you do that, but that's the point. All right, that's all for me for this reissue episode. I'll be back periodically to patch over the breaks, which we're going to take now, one of them anyway. And on the other side, join me 7 years ago for episode 76, and the Cubs making kind of a poor decision regarding their general manager's position. What else is new?
It's Crumble's birthday, and we're celebrating with a sweet deal. Today only, you can get a 6-pack of Crumble for the price of a 4-pack. That's 6 fresh gourmet desserts for the price of 4. Treat yourself, bring a friend, or share with family, because birthdays are better when everybody gets a little something special. Don't miss it. 6 for 4 desserts. Today only at Crumble.
One of the things that we all must learn as we go through life is a healthy respect and disrespect for expertise. Imagine a Venn diagram containing 2 circles. On the left-hand side is people who are experts in a particular subject, anything really, from plumbing to physics and, sure, baseball. We can label that circle subject smart. On the right hand is a circle containing people who have a general intelligence that is applicable to most situations in life, not just plumbing or physics or, sure, baseball. We can label that circle wisdom. Now, note where the circles overlap. It's actually a very small slice. We can venerate the man in the left-hand circle who knows physics when he describes to us his work with the particle accelerator at CERN. We may learn to despise him as an idiot when we ask him to comment on baseball or politics or simply to say something nice about his wife. He may not be capable of that. Thus, expertise is not necessarily the same as wisdom. It's the anglerfish luring us in with a glowing light that says, respect me, I know what I'm talking about, but we really have to know the basis of that light and what it really pretends for us when we're drawn in towards it. When chewing gum magnate William Wrigley came down with a fatal case of death in 1932, ownership of the Chicago Cubs passed to his son, Philip K. Wrigley. Still in his 30s, PK wasn't too interested in running a baseball team, so he arranged to have the club's second largest shareholder, William M. Walker, take over. Walker had been co-owner of the Federal League Chicago Whales with Charles Wiegman, the fellow whose name initially went on what is now Wrigley Field, and the two had been allowed to buy into the Cubs, really buy the Cubs, as part of the resolution of the conflict with the Federal League. As all professional sports leagues have found over time, rich people tend to lose interest in suing you for your monopolistic practices if you just let them be part of the monopoly. William Wrigley was part of that group too. Over time, Wiegman had to sell out to him, but Walker stayed in. William Wrigley's death and Phil Wrigley's disinterest didn't harm the baseball side all that much at first, because the team president was Bill Veeck Sr., who knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, he had leukemia, and he passed away in early October 1933. That meant Walker, kind of by default, became team president and, in effect, general manager. Walker had gotten rich on seafood. He had been in the fish wholesaling business going back to 1900. As one newspaper noted, he had learned the fish, the oyster, the clam, and the shrimp. He also figured he had learned baseball. Why shouldn't he have, having been in the game for about 20 years at that point? Well, he hadn't. One thing Walker didn't know about for sure was home road splits, the division of a player's performance into how he pitched or hit at home, which may be subject to distortion based on the idiosyncrasies of his home stadium, and how he hit or pitched on the road, where we assume or hope that the quirks of each park will kind of come out in the wash after you've combined everything into one big lump. Now, those kinds of stats were not generally circulated then. I'm not aware of them being generally circulated prior to Bill James, who used to publish them in the annual abstract, so you only learned about them after the season was over. But that doesn't mean that baseball people were not aware of such things. Just a couple of episodes back, I talked about how Ty Cobb visited the new Braves field in 1914 and immediately observed that the fences were so distant that no one would ever hit a home run there. And for the longest time, that was true. That is an awareness of park effects. When Joe DiMaggio would complain about just how far it was to the left center field fences at Old Yankee Stadium, that too is an awareness of park effects. And when Larry McPhail and Tom Yawkey got roaring drunk and agreed to trade DiMaggio for Ted Williams so that Williams could take advantage of Babe Ruth's porch in Yankee Stadium and DiMaggio could pop balls over the Green Monster, guess what? Also, park effects. They didn't have the stats, but they knew how it worked. Similarly, when they talked about, and please pardon this expression, it's just what they called it, players hitting Chinese home runs down the 279-foot left field foul line or the 258-foot right field foul line at the Polo Grounds, that too was an awareness of park effects. So they knew about the Baker Bowl for sure. The Baker Bowl was the home park of the Philadelphia Phillies from 1895 through 1938. It was a weird little park, packed into a small block in North Philadelphia. It could hold only, depending on which period of that span we're talking about, 18 to 20,000 fans. The dimensions of left field and center field were more or less normal, 341 feet down the line, 379 feet to the alley, 408 to center, but right field was ridiculous. It was 325 to the alley, Some sources say 300, and I'm kind of inclined to believe them, and about 280 to the right field wall. Since that distance was so short, there was a 40-foot tin wall topped by a 15-foot screen. On the wall, famously, was a deodorant ad. The Phillies use Lifebuoy. Why? Because they stink. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but the other weird thing about the park was that the Reading Railroad had a tunnel under center field, so the park bulged in the middle. I've tried really hard to discern that in photographs, and I can't quite see it, but many sources attest to the fact that it was there. And in old overhead shots, you can see the rail yards right next to the park, so it kind of makes sense. It must have been kind of odd to play center field and find yourself running uphill after certain fly balls. But as I said, that's just a note. The main thing is that if you look at a diagram of the ballpark or those aforementioned overhead views, it looks like the Vincent van Gogh of stadia. It's had its ear lopped off. It's just 2/3 of a ballpark. Observers at the time were not any less aware of the park's bandbox nature than people were aware that the Leaning Tower of Pisa leaned, even though they might not have had a protractor handy when they looked at it. You could see the angle, just as you could see the short walls in Philadelphia. Just wait until I get into that bandbox, Babe Ruth said in 1935 when visiting Philadelphia with the Braves. If I don't hit at least one home run a day, I'll make you a present of something, and you can name it. From what I've heard, it will be a cinch. And here's columnist Stan Bumgardner in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1938 as the Phillies were about to move out. The shift of the Phillies from the Baker Bowl to Shibe Park will make itself felt in the batting averages of the entire National League. Clubs with such slow-footed but big-muscled men as Lombardi of Cincinnati, who used to enjoy a Roman holiday hitting the fences at Baker Bowl, will find their averages cut in half at Shibe Park. The old catcher Jimmy Wilson, who managed the team in the 1930s, said, "A pitcher goes along well for 4 or 5 innings, and then a couple of pop flies, which would be easy outs in other parks, hit that wall for doubles or triples. I have to yank my pitcher and use maybe a couple more during a game. After one homestand, the staff is coming apart at every seam." Thus, baseball men may or may not have known that when Phillies right fielder Chuck Klein hit .386 in 1930, that was a combination of hitting .332 on the road and .437 with 26 of his 40 home runs at home. But they understood it in a, and please forgive the pun, ballpark way. Similarly, when first baseman Don Hurst hit .339 there in 1932, driving in a league-leading 143 runs, they probably had the sense that he hit .402 with 16 of 24 home runs at home, .274 with 8 on the road. They also understood when he slumped to .267 with 8 home runs total in 1933, despite playing in the park, that his performance was even worse than it appeared on the surface. They didn't know for sure that Hurst had hit .268 with a .308 on-base percentage and a .380 slugging, with just 2 home runs on the road, but as Irving Berlin wrote in the song Doin' What Comes Naturally, "My tiny baby brother, who's never read a book, knows one sex from the other, all he had to do was look." William M. Walker, pro fish vendor, didn't look. He traded for both Klein in November 1933 and Hurst in June of 1934. The Hurst trade, one of the worst in team history, cost the Cubs first baseman Dolph Camilli, an older prospect, he was 27, who would later win an MVP for the Dodgers. Think of the way things went for Luke Voit this year, and you kind of have the idea on Camilli, whereas Voit may yet prove to be a flash in the pan, we just don't know. Camilli turned out to be the real thing, regularly knocking 25 home runs a season, posting 400 on-base percentages, and driving in 100 runs a year. The team that Walker was responsible for, the 1934 Cubs, they weren't exactly bad. They went 86-65 and finished third, 8 games back of the Cardinals. They were in the race for 2/3 of the season, though they never did take it over. The final third, they were just a couple of games over 500, and even that was probably a little lucky as they were outscored during that period. It's worth noting that with Hurst on the team, he came over in June, the Cubs were 2 games under 500. In 51 games with the team, Hurst hit .199 with 3 home runs. He was kind of the self-destruct weapon of the Cubs. His OPS plus was 42. And that was it. That was the end of his career. They gave up a good player for him and he was gone. Klein was a very good all-star level player with the Cubs, just not an MVP candidate. He was a 3-win player, not a 5 or 7-win player that he was in the Baker Bowl, where on occasion he literally not only hit the ball over that wall for home runs or off the wall for doubles, but he hit it through the wall. I don't know what they ruled the ball that was hit through the wall. It was gone all right. It just wasn't gone in the traditional sense that we think of it. I hate to invoke John Sterling, who may be my least favorite regular broadcaster, but I'm just thinking it is high, it is far, it is through the wall. The reason it went through the wall is that the Phillies were perpetually broke, in no small part due to the fact that the park was such a decrepit, small bathtub of a stadium, and so they put no money into it whatsoever. Bathtub's not a bad description, actually. Red Smith once said that the Baker Bowl looked like a rundown men's room. If a fly ball hit off the roof, there'd be rust raining down on the customers. You had coal dust coming in from the Reading Railroad. I suppose this didn't affect the fans or the players particularly, but they were too cheap to hire somebody to mow the lawn, so they had sheep graze on it. And on 2 occasions, parts of it actually collapsed with spectators in the park, resulting in injuries and, yes, deaths. One other thing that diminished Chuck Klein's value away from the park was that he could no longer play in shallow right field and throw runners out at first base. Quite famously, in 1930, that big offensive year I mentioned, he threw out 44 runners from the outfield. You never see that. And he had 2 other seasons in the 20s. That's because, unlike, say, the Green Monster, the supports for the wall were such that if a ball hit them just right, they were solid enough that the ball would rebound almost all the way back to the infield. So if you had a right fielder with a good arm who understood how to play the wall, he could camp out behind first base, whirl, and make a peg to the first baseman to turn what should have been a hit into an out. The other problem with Klein as a Cub was that he became injury prone, and he missed about 40 games in 1934 with a bad hamstring pull. The Cubs had several other good players who were of Hall of Fame or near Hall of Fame quality, including their other outfielders, Kai Kyler and Babe Herman, Gabby Hartnett behind the plate, Billy Herman at second, Stan Hack at third. The pitching staff wasn't quite as talented, although it was good, and there was a not Hall of Fame but Hall of Very Good pitcher as the staff ace, Lon Warnicki, who went 22-10 with a 3.21 ERA that year. That's a 1.22 ERA plus, a 5-WAR season. They were just a little short. They were right in diagnosing that they had a problem at first base, which was initially staffed by their manager, Charlie Grimm, who was a light hitter, and they also tried Camilli, and if they had given Camilli more time, chances are things would have worked out better for them, certainly in the long term, if not the short term, but Walker went for Hurst instead, and the decision punished them badly in the short term and in the long term. The Cubs had gone to the World Series in 1932, and now, having missed 2 seasons in a row, there was some rumor that Walker would be on the way out. "The more I see of baseball, the more I think of the fish business," he said, "but I am not going to quit because I am in a hot spot. I will be president of the Cubs next season and have made my plans accordingly." Phil Wrigley changed his plans. He bought out Walker and took over the team presidency himself, for better and worse. He held that position through his death in 1977. According to the Chicago Tribune in August 1934, William M. Walker, president of the Cubs, can look any fish straight in the eye and tell how many hours it has been away from its watery home. It was probably true, and Walker sounds like he would have been a great guy to take with you to the docks to meet the shrimp boats as they came in, so that you might safely begin your career as an amateur sushi chef. But it wasn't true for baseball. He couldn't look a first baseman in the eye and know what would happen to him if he got away from his watery home. I'm Stephen Goldman. This is The Infinite Inning.
I feel that it must not be beyond the power of statesmanship to avert the awful disasters with which we appear to be threatened.
A fine thought, Mr. Prime Minister, lovely, wonderfully expressed, but I'm afraid that the shivering army is already nearly at the gate, and so we must flee and hide in shelter number 76. Put on your pants now, like a good boy.
Welcome back to the show. Few words on another subject, one that came to mind this past week as we watched the Atlanta Braves make a similarly quick exit from the 2018 postseason. The Braves were tremendous fun this season. They took their 72-90 record of a year ago, and they reversed it. That allowed them to win a National League East division that no one really wanted. I mean, 90-72 record is good by the standards of where they just come from, but not great by the standards of a team heading for the postseason. Ron Acuna was obviously one of the stories of the season, and not just for the Braves, but for all of baseball. That was probably my favorite aspect of the team, as I imagine it might have been yours. My second favorite aspect of their season was either Charlie Culberson randomly having this big year off the bench, or Anibal Sanchez coming back to post a 2.83 ERA in about 140 innings after putting up a 5.67 ERA over the previous 3 years. The Detroit Tigers, they're gonna get ya. I also was amused when Nick Markakis got off to a hot start, and suddenly everyone seemed to notice that he has a real chance for 3,000 hits, something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, just observing his pace over the last couple of years. He's now 763 away, heading into his age 35 season. He'd be further along and a better bet if he hadn't slumped badly over the last 2 months. He hit a powerless 256 over the last 2 months of the season, and he's going to be an interesting case if he makes it, because 3,000 hits, like 500 home runs or 300 wins, is a counting stat. It doesn't necessarily indicate quality, and in his case, he's just sort of been, in most seasons, decently solid, better than the alternative if the alternative is nothing, that kind of guy. I don't mean to put down his career. He's someone I actually have enjoyed watching, but I don't think anyone has mistaken him for a Hall of Famer before, and he's never even gotten an MVP vote. So it's going to be interesting to see how people react, because the only thing that has bent the voters in the Baseball Writers Association or the Veterans Committee away from those big round numbers that signify nothing has been the PEDs era. So Bonds and Clemens and so on, they don't go into the Hall of Fame even though they have those numbers that would automatically stamp your ticket. And I hope that this has freed them to think for themselves and not just let the numbers do the thinking for them. That's not the reason that I wanted to talk about the Atlanta Braves, though. The reason that I wanted to talk about them is this. Here, the Steve of 2025 must intervene to say I played a clip of the Tomahawk Chop music here. Once again, kind of fair use. Once again, I don't feel like getting in trouble for it, or at least hassled over it, so you're going to have to imagine that it's still here. I'm pretty sure you know what it sounds like, and you can look it up for yourself, as it has been played by dozens of other people who also do not own the copyright on said inside Indian quote-unquote music from countless westerns. And you know what? I find the whole thing so darn vexing, I would prefer to take a break before we resume. So give me a moment to compose myself, and on the other side, I'll continue the story of what came to be known as the Meeker Massacre. Spoilers.
It's Crumble's birthday, and we're celebrating with a sweet deal. Today only, you can get a 6-pack of Crumble for the price of a 4-pack. That's 6 fresh gourmet desserts for the price of 4. Treat yourself, bring a friend, or share with family, because birthdays are better when everybody gets a little something special. Don't miss it. 6 for 4 desserts. Today only at Crumble.
tomahawk chop, an Atlanta tradition that goes all the way back to 1991, which is to say it's not really a tradition at all. I find it disturbing. I know that others do too, from social media and other articles. And at the same time, I imagine that many practitioners of the tomahawk chop view it as the Atlanta Braves director of public relations, then director, I should say, said way back in a 1991 New York Times article, "We consider it a proud expression of unification and family." Were they, or are they right? I had to think about that a bit. On a personal basis, I think part of what bothers me is that I'm suspicious of any crowd activity, mass activity, even one as innocuous as, say, doing the wave, which doesn't seem to me to make any statement that's negative at all. It's just that I don't like the idea of subsuming myself into some kind of mass organism. It just runs counter to every instinct I have, both as kind of a prideful individual and also of this thing that's wired into me. It's the same thing that Groucho Marx had wired into him when he said that he refused to belong to any group that would have him as a member. It's kind of a self-punishing thing in a way, but like I said, it's also proudly individual. It might also be that the sight of a whole stadium of people making this weird bending arm gesture, which could also signify pouring a bucket of oatmeal over your head or touching oneself in a really aggressive way, has fascistic Nuremberg rally-like qualities. But I do think that there are more serious reasons that it is truly offensive. I think it's simultaneously a cultural appropriation and racially reductionist, and yet also fictitious. It's not racist in the same sense that the name of the Washington Redskins is just a straight slur, but rather it's racist in the same way that Chief Wahoo, now formally retired with the conclusion of Cleveland season, thank goodness, is racist, in that it's a reductionist caricature. The music is a pastiche of some Native American theme that might have come out of a movie, and the gesture itself is a travesty of Native American culture. They were and are a widely varied group, not a monolithic culture. That's one of the reasons that the white settlers were able to give them such a hard time, even though, at least at the outset, they were outnumbered. Well, another reason is that the Spaniards and other Europeans showed up much earlier and infected them with lots and lots of diseases that they had no immunity to. So there was this massive die-off, a catastrophe that we can only imagine in the sense of apocalyptic movies about rapidly spreading contagion. But the other part was they weren't one group. They were many distinct tribes with many different kinds of relationships, and we played them off against each other. They played each other off of each other. And they for certain weren't all going about in big groups waving tomahawks and threatening to scalp people. I believe they learned the scalping from settlers. Even had they not, there were some on the other side who went a great deal further with it. And when you read about some of the confrontations between American soldiers and Native Americans in the West, you will read horrifying tales of American soldiers riding away from those battles with Indian body parts on their saddles, right down to and including genitalia. Propaganda is propaganda, though, and that image of the wild Injun waving his tomahawk at the innocent white settlers was used to justify so much violence and appropriation. When President Andrew Jackson died, a guy who did as much to damage the Native Americans as anybody in history, the guy eulogizing him said, among other things, summing up his career, he survived the tomahawk. And yeah, he did. But he went looking for the tomahawk sometimes too, and he went looking for freed black people. He went looking for them as well. And one thing that's really awkward about the whole tomahawk chop thing is that it happens in Georgia, a state that conducted a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Cherokee, a campaign in which they had the help of that same Andrew Jackson. Then, many years later, they adopted the tomahawk chop from Florida State University with their team, the Seminoles, a tribe, an Indian tribe, which also got very harsh treatment from that same Andrew Jackson who invaded Florida just to teach them, and those freed black guys, a lesson He didn't invade them as president, by the way. He didn't order the army to invade. No, he personally invaded, and there's still some debate as to whether he was freelancing it or not. He just did it on his own authority. The Cherokee, they weren't tomahawking anyone. They were by and large assimilated farmers doing exactly what they had been asked to do. The Seminole situation is a little more complicated, and there was violence, but violence on both sides, and I can't tell you without making more of a study of it who started it, if that's even clear. But in any case, they massacred some people, and we massacred them back. And the fact is that what one group of Seminoles did to another group of white people doesn't say anything about all Seminoles or all white people. And yet, that's the way that we typically end up extrapolating from such incidents. They certainly did then. Can we pause and zoom in on that point for a second? This may be the best example of racism I know. It's the method by which people talk themselves into living in a world without mirrors. When, in the Old West or the Old South, wherever you want to locate things, whenever a Native American got drunk and killed someone, the white people said, all of those Indians are bad, we must drive them out. But, nobody has a monopoly on getting drunk and killing somebody. White people get drunk and murder others all the time, but yet no white person ever seems to say, we're bad. We should all rush to the river and drown ourselves, or failing that, move to Oklahoma. We'll call it white territory. No, what they say is, a shame about Johnny. He's just a bad egg. And they're right to say that, because generalizations are stupid. They're for stupid people who can't think. I realize that too is a generalization, but it's the exception that proves the rule. And of course, there were reasons for their thinking that way. There were things underneath the racism, in part that they coveted lands that they didn't have because maybe the railroads wanted them to put a railroad through there without interference. Maybe they wanted to dig for minerals there. And in fact, some of what I'm about to talk about, because I still have a little bit more to tell you, involves the fact that there was silver lying around in some of these places that Native Americans happened to be hanging out. Where they ended up hanging out after that was not where they had started, but in, as I alluded to just a few moments ago with white territory, Indian territory, which the federal government set up in what is now present-day Oklahoma. Oklahoma is actually the Oklahoma Territory smashed together with Indian territory, Indian land, like a theme park, where they sent everybody that they didn't want. The Cherokee ended up there. The Seminoles ended up there. And it's the exact same idea that the Russians had, just to give you one example, by establishing the Pale of Settlement, a designated area in the West to which Jews were restricted. They couldn't live anywhere else. It does not reflect well on a people, but we did exactly that. By we, I mean Americans. I have noticed from my listener statistics that I have various listeners from overseas. Thank you, by the way. But you are innocent and excused from the inclusive we that I have been using throughout, and I apologize. You did nothing. Then again, I'm sure someone in the history of your country did something nasty to somebody, because you're still human beings, even if you're not Americans, and we're just wonderful, wonderful critters. I was going to talk more about Georgia and the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears now to underscore how ridiculous it is to appropriate this not even real symbol of our vanquished foe, and to speak yet again of how we learn to disrespect people, by which I mean, first, an opponent, a competitor, is a conflict partner. They have something like equal power to you and self-determination, and so you have to respect them. As the balance of power shifts in your favor, you can start to take them a little more lightly. In fact, you can take their name and name your town or your football team or your buy-the-slice pizza shop after them. Anyone want to go get some Crazy Horse pizza? That's how you name your football team and your baseball team, Braves and Indians and Redskins. They used to be scary. Now they're safe, and so it's safe to invoke the scary without really feeling scared. You conquered their name. You own it. No one would call their football team the Atlanta Terrorists because it would be in bad taste. Why? Because they're still a going concern that kills people. Conversely, none of these tribal or generally Native American references started showing up in sports teams until not long after the Army slaughtered the Lakota Sioux at Wounded Knee, an event that is generally felt to have brought the Indian Wars for the West to a close. But it occurs to me that you don't need to hear it, and no one in Georgia needs to hear it because they know and they don't care. I wanted instead to just very briefly, in outline form, tell of a different moment in what came to be called the Indian Wars.
So before we paused for coffee and a snack, if I say snack like that to my cat, he gets very happy. I hope you are not affected the same way and didn't have to pause this and rush off for a cookie. If so, I apologize. I was talking about the tomahawk chop and the idea that a reductive pastiche or parody of someone else's culture is inevitably racist. And I don't know if what I'm about to say is a precise analogy, but I feel like it's close enough because it shows just how destructive one-sided thinking can be. That is, when you formulate and portray a feeling about someone or a group of someone's and don't let reality puncture the bubble of what it is you have conceived. This happened in 1879, and as I said before the break, it's one of the smaller corners of the conflicts between whites and Native Americans that happened continually throughout the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War. This is not Custer. This is not Geronimo. You don't hear about it a lot. And this isn't the only measure of things, but just before recording this bit, I went through as many Westerns as I could think of that hit on these themes, and I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of Westerns by any means, but so many corners of this conflict have been dramatized by Hollywood, whether in television or movies, and you'd think that there was no corner too obscure. I mean, in the 1950s, the Modoc War, which took place in Northern California / Southern Oregon and was just a tragedy for the most part, still got a film with Alan Ladd and Charles Bronson, of all people, as the Native American antagonist. As far as I can tell, that hasn't happened for this event, and it's probably for the best. So, as told briefly and virtually without notes, and I know I always say briefly and it's not true, it's going to be true this time. We're in Colorado in 1879. About a year earlier, a fellow named Nate Meeker got himself appointed via political connections as the Indian agent for the Ute Reservation, or one of the Ute reservations that existed in Colorado at that time. Now, when I talk about the Utes, and yes, Ute, Utah, that's where that comes from, it was a large and disparate group of Native Americans that was spread around that area, Colorado to Utah. And they had already come under a lot of pressure from Colorado, which had just become a state. Original Coloradans really wanted those Utes out of there. I'm not sure why, because the particular group that we're talking about didn't seem to bother too many people as far as I can tell. I mean, not that they didn't have a right to be there bothering people or not, but they were in primarily what was, and as far as I can tell, is a very sparsely populated part of the state, mostly at high elevation. That was their lifestyle. They prized horses. They had prized horses since the Spanish introduced them, and a lot of their culture revolved around how many horses you owned, and racing horses was a big part of their leisure time activities. They hunted buffalo, and the rest of the time, as far as I can tell, they largely kept to themselves in places where you would have needed an escalator to get at them. They had already been restricted to reservations by treaty, and because silver had been discovered on the southernmost reservation, they'd already had to give up a huge chunk of it. They had done this peaceably, in part because they were guided by one of their chiefs, a man named Ouray, who was a highly adept diplomat and negotiator. And Ouray seemed to understand that fighting was not the best tactic for a people so badly outnumbered and outgunned. So he gave ground where he had to and tried to get what concessions in return that he could. He doesn't make for as dramatic a hero as someone who fights to the last man and dies with a pile of bodies around him, but he makes for a better hero than that guy in a majority of cases. Nevertheless, his efforts don't stop the local white Coloradans for blaming the Utes for every bad thing that happened in Colorado, including forest fires, or from staging the odd massacre, most infamously the Sand Creek attack, which involved killing lots of women and children because, as the man who led the attack said, in disgusting terms that would have pleased any Nazi, nits make lice.
I've lost track of how many times I've mentioned that horrible line on this show over the years, but as you know, I firmly believe that we're only as strong as our willingness to confront the deep, dark, truthful mirror, as Elvis Costello called it. I'm calling this the final break of the episode. On the other side, who Meeker was and what happened.
It's Crumble's birthday, and we're celebrating with a sweet deal. Today only, you can get a 6-pack of Crumble for the price of a 4-pack. That's 6 fresh gourmet desserts for the price of 4. Treat yourself, bring a friend, or share with family, because birthdays are better when everybody gets a little something special. Don't miss it. 6 for 4 desserts. Today only at Crumble.
Meeker was about 60, and he was a failed writer and had also had a history in utopian communes, which was a thing in the middle of the 19th century. That's a whole other topic I'd be interested in investigating, where that movement comes from, which is sometimes called Fourierism. It's a combination, I think, of reaction to the Second Great Awakening and the Industrial Revolution. You combine the two and you have a whole lot of people thinking about how they can kind of change prevailing social trends, which are dragging people off of their farms and small communities and into cities and factories and so on. And so they build large houses and practice open marriage. I don't think Meeker was an open marriage guy, but anyway, he makes a decision about the Utes. He is going to practice his theories on them. You know, there's this movie from about 1970 with Dustin Hoffman called Little Big Man, which is kind of a travesty of the whole settling of the West and the Indian Wars. And Dustin Hoffman plays this kid who kind of ping-pongs back and forth between being a ward of the Native Americans and a ward of the white settlers. And so he gets a perspective on both. And it's a pretty good film. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Some aspects I think have dated a little bit. It can be pretty funny in places. Anyway, there's a sequence where Jack, played by Hoffman, runs into General Custer, played by Richard Mulligan, kind of the way Richard Mulligan played everybody, which was completely insane. And Custer, in this depiction, feels he has an almost omniscient way of determining who a person is and what he does just by looking at him.
It's right. That's impossible. I've never set eyes on you before.
Oh, I wouldn't figure you'd remember me, sir.
Furthermore, you don't look like a scout to me. Not a bit. A scout has a certain appearance. Kit Carson, for example. But you don't have it. You look like a mule skinner.
Well, I don't know anything about mules.
It's a remarkable thing, but I can tell the occupation of a man merely by looking at him. Notice the bandy legs. Strong arms. This man has spent years with mules. Isn't that correct?
Well, Yes, sir.
Hire the mule skinner!
Yes, sir.
That was kind of Meeker. He looked at the Utes and said, "You are not hunter-gatherers. You are farmers. Farmers you will be." And he didn't really stop to ask how the Utes felt about it. I'll tell you how they felt about it. They had absolutely zero interest in becoming farmers. A few of them tried it, got made fun of by the other Utes, and quit. And Meeker's reaction was to call in the army, continually. "Dear General Sherman and General Sheridan, these Indians are making fun of me. They laugh at me when I hand them a hoe and tell them to plant cauliflower. Please bring the army and make them farm or shoot them. Love, Nate." Well, even Sheridan and Sherman, who were generally pretty eager to deploy their soldiers on the western frontier, tended to laugh at these and crumple them up and throw them in the wastepaper basket. So Meeker, in an act of purely suicidal non-brilliance, decided to make a point. He plowed up the racetrack, which was centrally important to the Utes in the area, because, as I said, horse racing was a big part of their lives, their culture. It's a bit like deciding to plow up Fenway Park or Wrigley Field just because you don't like that so many people, quote unquote, waste their time at baseball games. When Meeker proposed doing this, the local medicine man shoved him around a bit. Note, I do not say that he thrashed him within an inch of his life or beat him until he had to go to the local frontier hospital. No, what I'm saying is, and this is as best as I can tell from the several accounts that I read, that he kind of shoved him around a little bit and knocked him out of his own front door. So Meeker writes the Army again, "Dear General Sherman and General Sheridan, my life has been threatened. I have been driven from my own home over this whole racetrack thing. Please, send the Army." Well, this time they kind of had to take it seriously. So they write to the local general. The local general dispatches a troop of about 150 people from the nearest fort, which is still like 175 miles away, and they start coming down. Now, the Utes get word of this, and this makes the Utes very, very twitchy, because they know what has happened to other people when the Army shows up. To wit, some of them end up dead, and the rest end up in Oklahoma, which is a haul from Colorado, and if you like Colorado, you don't really want to live in nowhere, Oklahoma. No offense to the Oklahomans. Well, I take some offense at James Inhofe, so let's just call it even. A group of Ute leaders headed by a chief named Jack, at least the Americans called him Jack. The Modoc leader in the affair I mentioned earlier was named Kinpuash, but was called Jack by everybody. I think Americans tended to say, "What's your name? Kinpuash? Yeah, that's too hard. You're Jack." So I'm not 100% sure what this Jack's real name was. It was probably something along those lines, too many syllables for we lazy folks to deal with, so he was called Jack. Well, Jack and the gang say to the Army, "Look, the northern boundary of our reservation is Milk Creek. Please don't cross that. We don't want to have any kind of conflict, and it makes us kind of edgy when you bring a lot of guys with guns onto our reservation. Why don't you just come down with a small group, see what's going on, and then we can make a determination as to what to do. But this way, there's no great big armed confrontation." And the man in charge on the Army side, a young major named Thomas Tip Thornburg, appears to have said, "You know, that's a pretty good point. That's good advice. That's what I'll do. I will not bring the Army across the creek. I will just come with a couple of guys." He lied. He brought them all anyway. And when Jack and his men saw the Army coming, they said, "This game has been fixed," and it's not clear exactly who started shooting. It could have been that a friendly wave from the Army side was misinterpreted as a signal to attack. In any case, Thornburg ends up dead, as do an additional 10 soldiers. There are about 50 wounded, all the horses get killed, and the survivors end up in the quintessential theatrical wagon circle, hoping like hell that someone will come along and bail them out. And that's what happened. The Army eventually sent reinforcements. Simultaneously, a separate group of Utes goes down to the reservation headquarters, murders Meeker in fairly violent fashion, murders every other male who's there, which is about an additional 10 people, and kidnaps the 3 women who are on the premises, including Meeker's wife and daughter. These 2 events, insofar as I can tell, were not coordinated, and they result, I think, from a group of people who were very frustrated with Meeker and were simply taking their revenge from having brought all the hell in the world down on them, and for having, in general, been so disrespectful. Meeker was writing the senator who got him his job, saying that if he wasn't going to get these guys to be farmers, then he was just going to starve them out. That was his plan. Great guy. And subsequently, by the way, a hero of the story. There are towns named after this guy. Everything that happened after that was an anticlimax, and I say that not to diminish any of the tragic events that followed. Sherman and Sheridan poured in about 4,000 soldiers and were just awaiting word to wipe these northern Utes off the face of the earth. They didn't get to do that because the women had been kidnapped. The Secretary of the Interior decided to put the brakes on the whole thing, the Interior Department being responsible for Indian affairs. They still are. and they sent a team to negotiate their release, which did happen. That they were returned alive is great. That they had been sexually violated is not so great. And as part of the subsequent negotiations to end this whole standoff, prosecution of roughly 12 of the Utes that were implicated in that crime was demanded by the American side. It kind of happened, and then they let it peter out because the greater goal was to get the Utes out of there. And as they thought would happen, as was inevitable from the very beginning, from when Meeker showed up with his big ideas, they did end up not in Colorado, but on a reservation in Utah. I'm not defending anything that the Utes did in this situation, with the exception of the envoy to Major Thornburg saying, please don't bring a lot of armed guys with guns onto the premises because that tends to have bad results for us. I just want to point out how much of the whole experience of the white government versus the Native Americans was predicated on ignorance, one-sided thinking, and coercion with guns. Even when the Native Americans complied, as the Cherokee did in Georgia, it didn't have a great outcome. So in Georgia, they said farm or die, and the Cherokees farmed, and they still wound up in Oklahoma. And Meeker said farm or die, even though there was no real reason for him to say so. It was just a whim of his. And once again, everyone wound up either dead or in Utah, which is sometimes tantamount to the same thing. And when it comes to the tomahawk chop, we need to think about that. In Richard White's recent history, The Republic for Which It Stands, which covers the post-Civil War period, he points out the Army attacked and disciplined non-citizen Indians in ways the government never attempted with citizen Southerners after the Civil War. That's very true, and it's a purely racist dichotomy. The government faced just as much violence in the post-war South as they did in the West. And in the South, it was at the hands of actual, no different than al-Qaeda terrorists, who were determined to deprive groups of people of their civil rights, sometimes, often, by killing them. President Ulysses Grant, whose administration is presently being rehabilitated, acted very tentatively and reluctantly. Congress had to pass no less than 3 different bills, empowering him to suspend the right of habeas corpus and outlawing the Ku Klux Klan activities that were being so destructive towards establishing a national government with uniform rights for everybody in the aftermath of the war. They finally did, through the Attorney General, prosecute some Klan members, broke the Klan in South Carolina, but as a result of the whole thing, the Attorney General's resignation was asked for. Grant issued pardons or commutations to many of those convicted, and Congress critters on both sides of the aisle started talking about how the federal government had too much power. This was at the exact same time that Phil Sheridan was going around saying, more or less, it's misquoted, that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And the Grant administration was repudiating a treaty with the Sioux that gave them, in perpetuity, the Black Hills of the Dakotas. But, Custer had found gold there, so never mind that. And as a result, Custer ends up dying fighting Native Americans when he could have been in the South fighting terrorists. It's not just the Grant administration, by the way. All of this business extends for more than 25 years after the end of the Civil War. Really, the upshot of the Civil War is that African Americans get the end of slavery, but virtually no other civil rights for 100 years. And with the slavery question settled in terms of political power between the North and South, Native Americans get to face a American polity that is uniformly focused on the wonderfulness of westward expansion, backed by an army that has been enlarged and professionalized, against which they have absolutely zero chance. And 150 years later, we do the tomahawk chop. And by itself, maybe it's a small thing, but it is racist because it misrepresents and dismisses an entire history for a wholly mythical gesture that has nothing to do with them whatsoever. Early in his career, the comedian George Carlin had a line where he said, "The Indians were good fighters. Just because they started in Massachusetts and ended up defending Malibu doesn't mean they weren't." And it's a funny line, but you have to understand that these folks got hit by history's truck. So when you sit in the ballpark and pump your arm up and down, hoping that Dansby Swanson delivers a game-winning single, and you think you're participating in a group activity that invokes some scary, triumphal Native American gesture, what you're really evoking is a tragedy and a long-lasting period of genocide. About the most benign thing you could call it is insensitive, but really we should all know better. We should all be better educated. We should all be more empathetic than Nate Meeker was. By Denard Span's rapidly graying beard, we have come to the end of another episode. You can...
As always, here is where I used to tell you where the guest could be found on Twitter and how you could follow me. But, of course, there is no more Twitter. Gone. Just doesn't exist anymore. And for the purposes of this reissue episode, the guest has not joined us. Therefore, I need only remind you that you can follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social.
You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search, knock, I'll let you in. There's none of this Three Little Pigs business where you have to try 3 times. All wolves are welcome. We love wolves at the Infinite Inning. And if you have a spare moment, please go to the podcatcher of your choice, rate us, review, subscribe. It brings attention to the show. It sends it shooting to the top of the podcast rankings that I have never seen, but I believe are out there. I have faith, and I hope you do too. We have a sponsor now, but nevertheless, this episode is brought to you by the number 2. Our producer is Throckmorton K. Skippy. Our theme song, which you are listening to now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. It's called The Infinite Man. Dr. Rick could not be reached for comment this week, but I will remember the time that he marveled at our unlimited capacity to be limited, and that therefore entropy is not our enemy, but our greatest friend. Well, if the Pachyderm Parade down Main Street doesn't direct traffic to the Flamingo Falls and thereby cause so much congestion that you miss the birthday party that you didn't want to have, I'll be back next week with more tales and discussion from inside the Infinite Inning.
That's all from past Steve and all from present day Steve too for this reissue episode. I will see you this weekend for a brand new Infinite Inning 346. Thanks for joining me for this reissue episode, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.
It's Crumble's birthday, and we're celebrating with a sweet deal. Today only, you can get a 6-pack of Crumble for the price of a 4-pack. That's 6 fresh gourmet desserts for the price of 4. Treat yourself, bring a friend, or share with family, because birthdays are better when everybody gets a little something special. Don't miss it. 6 for 4 desserts, today only at Crumble.